I got you. And that's Diane Hodges. Diane Hodges. Okay. Okay. Anything else that we need to be aware of? All right. I'm going to ask John, if you would, to lead us in a word of prayer before we begin. Amen. All right, so just a quick recap of last week. We began studying the lineage of Noah, from Adam down to Noah, and what was going on at this period of time, which is the pre-flood era. And we spent some time talking about Enoch, who was the first man who was taken up into heaven. He did not die. And so we spent some time discussing him. Then we spent some time discussing the book of Enoch, which is one of the pseudapocrypha, which means it is a book written under a name that is not the actual writer. So Enoch did not write the book of Enoch. Enoch lived many thousands of years ago, whereas the book of Enoch was written around between 300 and 200 BC. Now, where the material comes for that book is kind of a guess. It's possible that some of the information was passed down in the oral tradition of the Hebrews, which is how their history was passed down. But because we cannot verify a lot of the things that are said in Enoch, and to be quite honest, because a lot of the things are said are just weird, it is not considered to be canonical, meaning it's not part of the Bible as we know it. But it is quoted in the New Testament. It's quoted in the book of Jude, and we talked about that. And so at the very least, the part that is quoted we take to be real, and that's Jude about 1:3. I think it's verse 3, where that's quoted. So we spent some time talking about that, and my intention was to have moved on into the rest of the pre-flood world last week, but we didn't get that far, which is fine. And so we're going to continue with that. We're going to move on to finishing Genesis chapter 5 and moving on to Genesis chapter 6 today. And in preparation of that, I wanted to look at what the world was like at this period of time. It's a very interesting period of time, but we also don't have a lot of information about it, and a lot of it is conjecture. It's referred to in the scientific world as the antediluvian period. And so it's very difficult to paint an accurate picture of what's going on at this time. But there are a couple of questions that we can ask and answer with relative accuracy, right? One of the questions that you always ask about pre-flood Earth was, did it rain? And I think this is still an ongoing debate. It's an interesting thing. The Bible tells us that the ground was watered with the dew, but there's no mention of rain prior to the flood. And that becomes important when you begin the debate of, as the Bible describes the flood and the creation of the world before the flood, it talks about layers of water, right? There's a layer of water surrounding the firmament, and then there's water on the earth. And so when you're describing the pre-flood world, it's important to determine what that is. And so there's a couple of theories on that. I'm going to focus on 3. First is that this layer of water that's described surrounding the firmament is an extra layer of atmosphere. So we had a really thick atmosphere, which kind of created a greenhouse effect, which explains some of the things going on, like the super long lifespans and stuff like that. Another theory is the cosmic ocean theory, which is that it was kind of referring to space. It would have been a term that the writers would have understood because they look up at space through our atmosphere, and it looks, kind of like a cosmic ocean. That one didn't really make too much sense to me when I was looking into it, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. The one that is most common that you hear about when discussing this from a church point of view is the canopy theory. And that is that there was actually pre-flood a canopy of water or ice surrounding and encasing the earth at the time of the antediluvian period. Wow. Okay. And so when the flood occurred, this layer of water surrounding the earth fell to the earth. And that was at least partly how the earth was flooded. I don't have an answer as to exactly what that's talking about, but if you want to look at how it's described, you can look in Genesis chapter 1. And then, of course, if you want the account of the flood, you can look in Genesis chapter 7. And we will be looking at that. But the bottom line is that the world as it was prior to the flood was a different environment than the one that we are accustomed to. The climate seems to have been drastically different based on what we can tell. The wildlife was different. This would have been the period in which, if you are a creationist, this is the period in which we believe that the dinosaurs existed. And other, what we would consider monstrous critters. but big, different types of animals that no longer exist in our natural world today would have existed in this time. And it's also based on the description given in Genesis 1 and scientific evidence, because scientific evidence does support creation. This would have been the time of, if it ever existed as one continent, this would have been the time that the world existed as one continent. So Pangea is the scientific term describing that singular continent. And then as the flood happens, it talks about the waters of the deep. The deep opened up and the well springs flooded. This could have been a shifting of the tectonic plates, which split apart this one supercontinent into the continents that we know today. Any questions, comments, thoughts on any of that so far? I know that's kind of like condensing a lot of discussion into a very short period of time. Grant, I'm sure you probably have some stuff on that. Yeah, sure. Well, feel free, man.
Well, we have found recently, there's always been the question of like, what does the Bible mean by the fountains of the deep, the great fountains of the deep?
And we found the underwater oceans.
Yeah, underwater oceans. However, interesting to note that the underground ocean is not liquid. It is composed of a mineral that has water like incorporated into it, and when it is exposed, it like explosively undergoes a chemical reaction and expels all of the water. So when the Bible mentions that the great fountains of the deep opened up, we can imagine that it is all of this like explosive action happening. And from how our plate tectonics work nowadays, probably like that fault line in the middle of the Atlantic,
Right.
where the plates are going apart instead of towards each other. We can imagine like towering geysers of
Right.
water, like a massive wall of water shooting up in the air, because all of this explosive reaction is happening, just moving all of that water that was in the rock underneath the ocean floor into the ocean, causing it to swell.
And we also know, of course, that water would have been very heated as well, more than likely. Mm-hmm.
In our co-op this year.
Okay.
And one of the things that I told the kids was my mind, like through my whole life, I never envisioned the flood as being so
Violent, yes.
You know,
Yes.
a lot about, rain and water rising and things like that. And I didn't think.
The lone person sitting on the rock, that's watching the water rise. Yeah. Right, right.
And so I always thought about it like it's a slow process.
Right.
And as we were going through it, I told the kids, I said, I've been raised being creationist and, all of this stuff that lines up with what I believe, but I've never had the flood presented this way
Right.
to me before, where I thought, oh my goodness, I never thought about how just aggressive
Yes.
that process would have occurred.
Yeah, even the rain would have been extremely aggressive rain like we've never seen, because if you follow the canopy theory and you believe that this canopy collapsed, it would have been a very quick thing. Which again, I'm not sure that that's correct, but it is widely believed. I think Apologetics Press, I think that's what they teach, the canopy of water around the earth. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And we don't mention that enough. And of course, when you're teaching kids, you're not going to teach them about tectonic plates and geysers and all this stuff, right? But when you go back to revisit it, it's very interesting to look at how this would have played out. It really was a destructive process. The earth was completely changed from atmosphere down to land masses. It was completely changed by this event. And it's very interesting to go back and look at that from a scientific and a historical perspective. Right. Right.
Small areas, this was worldwide. Everything was covered and destroyed and pushed away.
Happened so fast that yeah, it was immediate, and it, if you go back and look at fossil samples from this time now, there are petrified items that were petrified very quickly. And Grant, the reason I was looking at Grant when I said this is because he gave one of the first lessons where I actually got to meet Grant and see him was he gave a presentation to the youth on this type of event. It was very good, very informative.
And you can find sea creatures petrified
Mm-hmm.
on top of mountains.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
well, and yeah, it's very hard to ignore the flood. And the interesting thing about the flood, and something we'll probably touch on more next week, is that every culture, every major culture that has ever existed has a flood story. So it's like a universal event that occurred. One of the oldest accountings of the flood is actually not the Bible, it's the Epic of Gilgamesh. Historically, written down accounts is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was a Babylonian account of the flood. And so it was this global event. All societies recognize that it existed. It's only relatively recently, that we decided that this event may not have happened, and the earth was, millions of years old and all that. So that's in the grand scheme of things, a very recent theory that doesn't hold water if you look at the evidence. So, but regarding the world before the flood, before it was changed, it was drastically different. And there were a lot of things mentioned just in Genesis chapter 6 and referenced elsewhere in the Bible that I wanted to look at this morning, because I'm a nerd and these things are nerdy and they're very interesting. And so that's what we're going to look at this morning, is focusing on the world as it was leading up to the flood. And so that's going to begin. We're going to look at the last couple of verses in Genesis chapter 5, beginning at verse 30. Then Lamech lived 595 years after he became the father of Noah, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. And Noah was 500 years old, and Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So that is the end of the line between Adam and Noah, which is the first list that is given. I can't remember what the term is for, but it's the first list that is given regarding genealogy. There you go. That's the word I was looking for. Yeah. You have the genealogy of Cain, but regarding the genealogy that eventually leads to Christ, the genealogy of Seth, this is the first one given. And it ends with Noah and his sons before we go into chapter 6, which describes what's going on in the world prior to the flood. If someone would read for me Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4.
Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives of them, of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men under them.
And what translation are you reading from? New King James. Okay. That's going to become important in a minute. But let's go through it, and let's start in verse 1. When men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, then the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Okay. This is a debated topic among the church. And the question becomes, who are the sons of God that are referenced here? And I'm going to open the floor with that question because I have a feeling that we're going to get both perspectives, both major perspectives out of y'all. So I'm going to let y'all answer that. Who are the sons of God that are referenced in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1?
Some people believe that there were angels
Okay.
that came down, and then other people tend to lean into this idea that more, it's just a way of referring to males as sons of God, daughters as, I don't
Yeah,
know,
those.
I don't differentiate on that way, but
So those are the two prevailing theories. The one is that these were angels, and the other is that this was the line of Seth. The men were the line of Seth, and the women were the line of Cain. That's why it's referenced as the daughters of men. We're going to cover that first. So that's basically all it is. I mean, there's not a whole lot to cover, but it's basically that there are two groups of people mentioned here. You have the line of Seth, and those are the sons of God, because if you read back in chapter 5, it talks about them worshiping God, right? The first act of corporate worship and stuff like that. It says they began to call on the name of the Lord. That may actually be chapter 4, the end of chapter 4. But it says they begin to call on the name of the Lord. And so there is the idea that these are referenced as the sons of God because they were the faithful line. And then the daughters of men is reference to the female offspring of Cain. And they intermarried, which as you get down into chapter 4, if you follow this theory, this marriage was not ordained by God, and it led to offspring that were not good people. All right, and that's, in a nutshell, the one theory. The other is a more supernatural theory. And it is based on some scripture. It's also based largely on the book of Enoch. But the theory is that there was a cast of angels that fell from grace because they lusted after human women, and they married human women, and they had offspring with human women. And from this comes, as the King James and New King James translate, giants, but the word there is Nephilim. And we're going to get to them in a minute, but first I want to discuss what the sons of God are based on this theory. And I'm not pushing one theory or another. I'm just explaining it as it exists. So I'm going to go to a couple of places in Daniel chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. If you would turn with me there briefly. And I promise this will make sense by the time I'm done. But in Daniel chapter 4, beginning in verse 13, I was looking in the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. He shouted out and spoke as follows: chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it, in the new grass of the field, and let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whom he wishes, and sets over it the lowliest of men. That word for watcher there is ear. And it's used 3 times in the Bible, all in this chapter. Refers to an angelic being here. The reason that I asked you to turn here is because this is mentioned in the Pseudepigrapha, specifically the book of Enoch, which we talked about briefly last week, and we're going to talk again briefly here. I'm not going to go into everything it says, but it references heavily this cast of angels called the Watchers, and it names them as the progenitors of the Nephilim. So if you prescribe to this theory that angels mated with human women, Enoch seems to indicate that it was the Watchers. And so when you hear people talk about this, you will hear the Watchers mentioned, and that's why I bring it up. Again, the book of Enoch is non-canonical, right? It's not scripture. And so it's hearsay as to anything in that book being accurate other than what is quoted by Jude, because we ascribe Jude as being an inspired writer. But that's the other place where this term watcher is mentioned. And again, it's referencing angelic beings who mated with human women, and God frowned upon this mating, and so these angels are considered fallen. And that comes in handy when we get to talking about the Nephilim. Any questions, comments, or thoughts when discussing watchers or Genesis 6, verse 1, in either of the theories that we just discussed? Yes.
I think a lot of times, especially in the Church of Christ, people tend toward non-supernatural.
That's true.
And I think, like, I understand where that comes from, and God, by his nature, is supernatural. And so I think when we are engaging with the question of what does this mean, it is important to be mindful that I'm not just assuming that it is not supernatural.
Mhm.
At the same time, I think it's fair to not assume that it is like the other side either. I think just being aware that my personal bias could interpret how, or
Mhm.
how I interpret what it's saying, and understanding that at the end of the day, half of us are probably wrong, and maybe all of us are wrong. Maybe it means something completely
I do think it's, you know, we talked about with the flood, that is a cross-cultural idea, and
Mhm.
that's kind of one of our proofs of why we can say that this happened. I think when we look at other, like, mythologies, the concept of the gods coming down and having children with human women happens in most cultures, and so I think there could be some merit to supernaturally something happened and these people were different than normal people. And Greek mythology is not scripture. So I think it's wherever we land on it, I think it's okay to be gracious with one another, to be gracious with ourselves, and understand we're probably not getting the full picture either way.
And it's also important to note that none of this has bearing on your salvation, whether you believe one way or the other. This has no bearing on your salvation. This is just to give you an idea of what was going on in the world as we lead up to the flood, because the flood and some of the symbolism involved there that is mentioned later on in the New Testament is relevant. There is some relevance there. But in order to understand the flood, you have to understand what was going on leading up to it and why God decided to do what he did. And so that's why we're discussing these things. But it is an academic discussion. Yes, sir.
Also, like I said, there are all of these legends from around the world
Yes.
about giants and about supernatural beings having super children with humans.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when people compare that with the Bible, and they don't want to discount the idea that maybe these legends have a grain of truth, because
Most legends do. Correct.
and they'll say, well, does that mean that some of these giants, does that mean they survived the flood? But if you look there in verse 4 of Genesis chapter 6, it says that there were giants or Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also after.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, and then it says, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bore the children. And those were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown, legendary hero kind of stuff. And so the Bible presents that this was happening before the flood, and then the flood happened, and then it was happening again
Mm-hmm.
after the flood. And that's how we get all of our legendary heroes like Gilgamesh and
Mm-hmm.
Hercules and fill in the blank, right?
Yeah, and it goes back all the way to Sumerian culture, one of the earliest known cultures that we have written record of. It goes all the way back to that with reference to, and the Aztecs and the Mayans and all these ancient cultures with reference to a term called God King. It is possible that these references to God Kings, modern science, they are hung up on this idea that, particularly with the Mayans, they were visited by aliens, right? That's the prevailing theory, is that they were visited by aliens. But this reference to these beings and these God Kings and stuff like that, it is possible. However impractical or improbable, it is possible that they were referencing Nephilim. Because at the very least, whether you believe the Nephilim are the offspring of the fallen ones or the Watchers or whatever, there is no question that if you read Genesis 4, it describes them as supernatural. And then, of course, if you go to Numbers, the description given by the spies regarding, and this is the only other passage in Numbers 13, this is the only other passage where this term is used, this specific word, Nephilim, is used. They were described as being giants, that they were ants in their eyes, I believe is the description given. And so terrifying beings. And also that also presents the idea that they still existed at the time of Numbers. When they are getting ready to go into the promised land, they encounter at the very least the offspring of Nephilim. Goliath is referenced as being the son of Anak, or one of the sons of Anak. The Anakim is the word. And Anak is tied to the Nephilim. But some interesting facts about Genesis 6:1 before we get into the Nephilim very quickly. The phrase Bene Elohim, which is sons of God in Hebrew, is not used, believe it or not, it is not used all that often in the Old Testament. Now, the phrase sons of God in the New Testament is used quite often to refer to Christians. But it's not used all that often in the Old Testament. Matter of fact, the only one that comes readily to mind, I'm not saying it's the only one, but the only one that comes readily to mind is a reference in Job. And in Job, does anyone know who is being referenced when we talk about the sons of God? I'll give you a clue. Satan was numbered among them. It's referencing angels in general. It says that the sons of God were required to present themselves before God, and Satan was numbered among them. He was required to present himself as well. And this is where God asked him, where have you been? I'm going to and fro on the earth. Have you considered my servant Job, how there's none like him in all the land? And thus begins the story of Job. Yes?
Also, what Nebuchadnezzar refers to as a son of the gods in the book of Daniel.
Yes, there is.
It's almost obvious that it's an angel.
Mm-hmm.
I say almost obvious. It's not explicitly called an angel, but what else would it be? And he calls it son of the gods.
Well,
Of course, he's a Babylonian, so he's not going to say son of God, but he's going to say son of the gods.
Well, and in the New Testament, the other piece of evidence that seems to support this theory is that in the New Testament, in 2 Peter and in Jude, they both reference the fallen angels and their punishment. And it is believed that they were actually, again, referencing the book of Enoch, which of course referenced the fallen ones. Enoch did have a heavy effect on Christianity at that time. Even though it was non-canonical, the Jews of the time period would have been familiar with it. And so either they are referencing that book, which again, these are still inspired writers, or they are referencing this time period specifically, still inspired writers. And so there is a reference to the fallen angels who were punished. Now, obviously you have Satan and his angels who are fallen as well. But this group seems to be specific to those who took human wives, if you follow that line of thought. And again, that's just one line of thought. It's just the more complex one, which means it takes more time to talk about. The other one's fairly simple. Sons of God being the line of Seth, daughters of men being the line of Cain, intermarried. Not a good thing. But whichever one you follow, as you go down into verse 4, you have reference to the Nephilim. All right, and you've heard us reference it multiple times as giants, and there is some evidence to support, like I said in Numbers 13, it references the Israelite people as being like ants in their eyes, and of course Goliath, as we all know, was about 9 feet tall, right? So definitely a giant. And there is some debate as to what that word means. Some just believe that the word Nephilim is literally the Hebrew word for giant. As I was digging into that, there's an interesting thought on that. So when the Septuagint is translated in, what was it, about between 3 and 200, somewhere around in there, BC? Yeah, somewhere between 3 and 200 BC. We have the translation of the Septuagint. We have the Jews losing Jewish culture to Hellenism. And so they needed a translation of the Bible that they could read, of the Old Testament that they could read, because they were losing the ability to read Hebrew. And so it is translated into Greek, and that is the Septuagint. And when this particular word, which in Hebrew is Nephil or Nephail, when it's translated into the Greek, The word used for translation there is gigantes, which is the Greek word for giant. And so they, at the very least, considered the Nephilim to be giants. And then, of course, the Latin Vulgate was translated from the Septuagint. And so you have the translation of a translation and the word there describing giants. And so when you get to the King James Version of the Bible, they don't reference the word Nephilim because it has already been assumed that the Nephilim are giants. However, the root of that word is 3 Hebrew symbols basically for N, P, and L. That's basically how Hebrew works. There are no vowels. You got to use context clues to figure out what they're talking about. And those 3 symbols are also used for the word Nephal, which is very similar to Nephiel or Nephiel. Nephal means to fall. And so it is also possible that this word does not literally mean giant. I'm not debating that they were big. The evidence supports that these guys were giant. But it is also possible that this word refers to the fallen ones, which if you ascribe to the idea of fallen angels being the progenitors of the Nephilim, then calling them the fallen ones would track. But reading verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. The way that's worded can be interpreted a number of ways. It's almost like, are the Nephilim the offspring, or were they just around in these days? The general consensus is that they are the offspring of whoever the sons of God and the daughters of men were. And they were violent. That is the general consensus. And that is supported by what we encounter in Numbers 13. And I believe that's around verse 33. But they were a warlike people. They were violent, they were dominant, and just generally not good. And they were also powerful. And so you have reference, as Catherine mentioned, you have reference all around the world of these demigods. It's not just a Greek philosophy. It's every culture has reference to demigods. And so if you're looking at it from a cultural and biblical mythological, this is the biblical version of a demigod, regardless of whether it's the offspring of an angel or the offspring of Seth. The way they are described, mighty men who were of old, men of renown, men that were so big that the average people were considered ants in their eyes. These would have been the biblical version. And if you believe the Bible, which we're all biblical believers here, and you believe that it's the first account, then all of these others would have spun off from this original account. Yes?
The other thing that I'm thinking is helpful when we're trying to figure out some of these really challenging things is that in all of these cases, the biblical writers were using the words that they knew to try to explain something that was very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are looking from like however many separations of understanding.
Right.
And we're just trying to go based on the words that they used to try to explain what they were witnessing or what was told to them.
Mhm.
And the words are not always precise and exact in the way that we think.
Specifically Hebrew, yes. It's not a precise language. I would agree.
So it's an unrealistic expectation to think, oh, I can just read it and understand it, and they're using precise language that is going to fully explain what I'm looking at. Like they didn't have scientific thought the way that we do. We're very particular with our words and things like that. And they were inspired, and so the words that they were given was by design.
Mhm.
And I think part of that design is that it's really foggy.
Well, we also are looking through a foggy window because we're looking from our own perspectives, right? It's very difficult to set aside what we consider to be true, what our opinion is, and set that aside and look at something objectively. Not just the Bible, anything. We look at everything through our own lenses, right? And so when you have generation after generation of thought processes affecting us, it's difficult to set all of that aside and say, okay, what were these Nephilim that are mentioned, close to 10,000 years ago? What were these things? Well, all we have are about 3 or 4 passages that talk about these guys at all. And so, like I said at the beginning, most of what we're discussing right now is conjecture. It's very difficult to nail down exactly what they were beyond the descriptions given in the Bible in Genesis 6, Numbers 13, and then I cannot remember where Goliath is referenced as the son of Anak, but I would assume somewhere around 1 Samuel would be a safe bet.
Well, of course, 1 Samuel 17 is where King David fight.
Right.
At the end of 2 Samuel, Goliath and his 4 brothers are mentioned as sons of Anak.
There it is. Okay, great. So outside of these passages, there's not a lot mentioned about the Nephilim. But what we can assume, and what is given based on the description later on when the Israelites encounter these people, but what we can assume based on the fact that they did not survive the flood is that they were not good people. Because the very next verse after these guys are described, mighty men, men of renown, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth. That's the very next description given. All right, so we can assume that the Nephilim were part of this evil on the earth, and that is going to bring us up to the flood, is that the earth was evil, except as we go down to verse 8, 6-8, Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And as, of course, we know from studying this for years, Noah and his family are the only ones that are saved in the flood, which is what we will cover next week. Any comments or questions? Thank you very much for your attention.